Well, now let's turn to Greg Cassidy, who's building the Motrak model fire station in S scale. Greg, welcome.
Hi, Jim. Let me bring everything up. I have that. I have my pointer, and if you can all see, we're now starting week 2. So if you recall, we're building the Alton Bay fire station from Motrak models. I'm building it in S scale. It's available in N, HOS, and O, and hopefully there's some of all these out there, and most of them will go together pretty much the same way. So today we'll be covering assembling and painting the walls, and painting and assembling the doors, and there's a reason those are in a different order, and we'll be painting the corner trim. Now, as you recall from last week's episode, this kit is supplied with both inner and outer walls. The outer walls are from clapboard milled stock, and they have the grain running this way, as almost all clapboard does. And the inside walls is just straight basswood, and the way Jeff cut it, the grain is running this way. So when you put the outer and the inner walls together, you have grain running in both directions, and you have some really nice plywood, and it's very stiff. And that means that as you put this kit together, you don't need to do any bracing on it. And that's a really neat option if you decided you wanted to detail the interior of this, because there's nothing that spoils a nicely detailed interior like bracing. So the first thing I did, I put together the inner and outer walls. I didn't glue them, I just put them together so that all the tabs lined up and taped it. I wanted to see how all the tabs go together and how it fit into the base. So a little bit of tape on all 4 corners just to see how it goes together and how the tabs work. And you can see here what I'm talking about. The inner walls, in this case, have 2 tabs, and the outer walls have 3 tabs. So when you put it together, whether it's flat or it's actually a corner, the inner tabs fit each other and the outer tabs fit each other. So the one thing I figured was I don't want to just glue the inner and outer walls together, each as a separate unit, and then find out maybe I was a touch off and the tabs didn't fit together. So as I was gluing the inner and outer walls together, I'd make sure I had it lined up and held up against another wall with another set of tabs, so that as the glue was setting up, all of the tabs from one wall to the next wall were fitting together. So I'd put a little glue on the outer wall, I'd move my block and put it against the inner wall while it's sitting in these tabs, put the block back up against it, and let it sit like that. Now the corners are not glued, it's just the walls being glued to each other. And then I did that again with the second wall. And in this case, I'm gluing the inner and outer of the side walls together, and I have the tabs from both ends holding them aligned so that I'm sure as the glue sets up, all the tabs will fit together. And I'm glad I did that. It worked out perfectly when I went to put it together, and I usually don't have that kind of forethought, so I was lucky this time. So once I had all 4 of my wall sections glued together, I started painting them. And as I said when we were doing the tower, I didn't want the paint to look new. I wanted it to look a little worn, but it's a fire station. It's not going to look dilapidated. So I did some dry brushing on, and this kind of shows you what it looks like. It's not a nice, heavy, fresh coat of paint, but it isn't peeling and rotting away either. And that's what the kind of look I was going after for my fire station. So then I did the same thing with the other 3 walls, just dry brushing on the paint and let them sit aside. And obviously with the 2 pieces of wood, I didn't have to worry about any warping, and I didn't need to do any bracing. And you can see here the variation that you get with the dry brushing, and yet it really doesn't look like the paint's peeling or anything. I've done a couple other buildings where the paint just, it looks like it hadn't been painted in a decade. And I didn't want this to be one of them. So while they were drying, I went to paint the roof trim, and the trim that goes underneath the roof are together on one fret of wood. So I put my paint on them, again, trying to dry brush it on. And then I used the red to paint the fish scales that we have here that sit inside our insert there. Now, once they were dry, I went to cut them out. The easiest way was to just cut apart the fret. That way it wasn't putting any stress on it. And then these 4 tabs hold the 2 pieces together. And what you actually have here is the front and the back pieces of roof trim. Now, once they're cut out, you have the little areas where the frets were that held them together. And I'll always take a sanding stick to that and sand them off. Don't hold it the way I'm holding it while you sand it. I was just holding it for the picture, but you want to actually hold this piece while you're sanding it, or else it'll probably break like a turkey wishbone. So once you have these done, this is what you have. This is the front roof trim, and this is the back roof trim. And I hit them lightly with my sanding stick because the paint had gone on just a little too even, and I didn't want it to stand out as being different from the walls. So now we put the stain over the paint the same way we did on the tower. And this is kind of a light stain, and it was just to add a little bit of blending to our paint. And you can see that I then put the stain on all of the walls, and you're just basically putting it over the paint. And it helps give it a little bit more of a weathered look, but it still doesn't look too worn. Now, the way that the inner and outer walls were made, there's a place for the roof trim on both the end walls. And this is where you have the inner wall right here, and the trim will glue to that. And the reason these are separate pieces, think about it. This is clapboard, and this is just flat wood. It couldn't be made as one piece. So I glued both of those in place and then just clamped them with some clamps while they were drying. And now I came back and stained those as well. I wanted them to be glued in place while I put the stain on because there wasn't anything else holding them. And even though it's not really thin wood, once it's glued in place, it's not going to bend or warp or anything. So putting the stain on after it's glued in place didn't hurt anything. Now we're going to be painting and assembling the doors. And you see in the previous one, we assembled and then painted the walls. And here we're painting and assembling the doors. We're going to paint them first. Now they come with some other parts in it that we'll get to in a future week. But what you have here are the front doors to the building. These are the inner parts and the outer parts, the outer trim parts. So I was going to paint the outer trim white first, and I just put some tape over the other pieces so in case I was sloppy with my brush or something, I wouldn't get it on it. If you've ever had any paint that has been sitting for a while and gets kind of thick, I've got one of these little Micro Mark paint mixers. They really do a good job, and they're really pretty cheap, and I haven't killed the batteries in mine yet, and I've had it for quite a few years. So I found it very useful, and this paint was quite thick until I mixed it up, and then it went on pretty nice. So I went ahead and just used my brush and painted them on. I didn't try dry brushing them, and I'll show you why in a little bit. After I painted them and the paint was dry and I cut them out, I did a little bit of distressing on them. I've got a wire brush and I just hit them very lightly with a coarse sanding stick. And that puts a little bit of distress and also puts some grain into the wood. And now it was time to paint the inner door red. So I used the signal red that I had and I put it on. And I did do a little bit of dry brushing effect here because this is going to be seen a little more easily than the white paint on the wood. And then after all those had dried, I just glued the outer trim onto the inner door, made sure they were all lined up, and I used a little bit of my Aleene's tacky glue for putting that on. And you can see here the effect of distressing the wood. It gets a little bit of a wood grain in it. And you can see the paint on the inner door doesn't look like it's in dire need of painting, but it looks like it's been around for a little while. And then I went over it with the greige stain as well. And you can see here the difference between the one that was stained and the one that isn't stained. And it just adds a little bit of the accumulated dirt and crud that an inner city building is going to get. And the last thing we're going to tackle is our corner trim. Now, the corner trim for the S scale is angled strip wood, and it is for the O scale as well. I believe for the HO and the N scale, it's just square strip wood that fits inside. And while I haven't seen the walls for those kits, I don't think they have the tabs on the outside, so they have a place for it. But anyway, what we're going to do with it here is the same, regardless of which type of trim it is. I went ahead and used my gray paint and did some dry brushing on them. And this came out pretty much looking the same as the walls do, because the dry brushing had the same effect on it. Sometimes I find the consistency of your paint can sometimes affect how easily or difficult it is to use the dry brush method on it. So the next thing is the trim around the door. And this is the same in all the kits. And it's basically just a red frame. So it's one piece of square strip wood. And I just painted it red. And then afterwards, I stained it. And you can see I did a little dry brushing on it, so it wasn't completely solidly red. And when you have a piece to stain like this, the thing I do is I just dip it in my bottle, let it sit for a few moments, pull it out, turn it over and dip it in again, and it's stained. So we have all of those pieces drying now, and that'll be the end of tonight. Next week, we'll be painting and assembling the windows, installing the windows, and then assembling the walls. So does anyone have any questions?
Greg, that seems like that kit's going together fairly easily for you too. I mean, that seems like an easy kit to build.
It is. We need more challenges here. Where's the white metal?
Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Jim.
Next time you'll have to pick something harder.